is spoken about in other places. In other places, and it's spoken about this sort of this symbiotic relationship between the tzaddik, the nasi hador, the tzaddik of the generation, and the people of the generation. That our actions elevate the tzaddik and also can cause a spiritual descent to the tzaddik as well. So when we behave negatively, that has a profound effect on the tzaddik as well. And that's sort of what Rashi is saying. Hashem tells them, Lech, raid, descend from your level of spirituality that Moshe experienced a yerida because of the Chet Egel. Okay, that's actually a fascinating topic in and of itself. I don't even want to talk about that for a moment. I want to give another interpretation of Lech Raid, of why Hashem told Moshe Rabbeinu to descend from the mountain at the moment of the Chet Egel. And this is a Peirush from Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, the founder of the Musar movement. I saw this Peirush in the Eish Tamid by Rabbi Druk. And he gives he quotes Rabbi Yisrael Salanter here. He gives a fascinating explanation. And he says as follows. He says, He says, the entire world, as the Rambam says, and the Gemara Masechtas Kedushin says, that we have to look at the world as in a constant state of where the scales are completely even. And our one action will either tip the scale, tip the entire world towards goodness, or chas v'shalom, our negative action can tip the entire scale towards negativity, and that brings negativity into the world. The Alter Rebbe talks about this in Tanya as well, the power of our actions, that we have the power to actually tip the entire world one way or the other. In other words, the world exists sort of in this fragile state of basic equilibrium, and one action from us can tip the scale to the other in the other direction, either towards good or towards negativity. So says Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, he says, so what protects the world? If the world is in such a fragile state that one action could be mashpia, such negativity onto the world, one action from one Jew. And that's how we're meant to look at the world. Kedushin says this, the Rambam says this. So what protects the world? So says Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, the tzaddik can protect the world. That the tzaddik's presence brings protection, brings a shmira, brings protection from physical protection, spiritual protection, and even protection from Hashem's gezeros. There's a Gemara Masechet Sanhedrin that says, what's the definition of an apikeres? What's the definition of a heretic? And the Gemara says that a heretic is somebody who says that the tzaddikim, that the rabbanon of the Talmud, the rabbis of the Talmud were not like rabbis today. They were tzaddikim. They're all tzaddikim. That the rabbanon are only in it for themselves. They learn chumash for themselves. They learn mitzvah for themselves. So they're doing it for themselves. So that doesn't benefit anyone. That, says the Gemara, is the definition of apikeres, because we need to recognize that the tzaddik's presence here is not, the tzaddik doesn't live just for himself. That the tzaddik's learning and his inspiration and his davening, it protects the entire world. And so therefore, says Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, when Hashem wants to bring a punishment to the world, when he wants to bring affliction to the world, when he wants to punish Klal Yisrael, he removes the tzaddik from the world. So he says, in order to bring that punishment to the world. However, we understand this, because obviously the world's been punished when there's tzaddikim here as well, but clearly when tzaddikim are here, they bring some level of spiritual shmira. And by the Chet HaEgel, Moshe Rabbeinu wasn't in the world. He was up on Har Sinai. And the Jews engaged in the Chet. And so Hashem tells Moshe Rabbeinu, and this is fascinating because on one hand, Hashem tells Moshe Rabbeinu, says, Hashem tells Moshe Rabbeinu, Lech Raid, descend, because he wants Moshe Rabbeinu's protection there for Klal Yisrael. But on the other hand, Hashem himself tells Moshe Rabbeinu, I'm going to destroy them all, and we'll start all over. It's like, which one is it? We see the same type of dynamic by Sodom and Gomorrah. On one hand, Hashem wants to destroy them. On the other hand, he tells Avraham Avinu, so Avraham Avinu will protect them. And Avraham Avinu will daven for them. So which one is it? And the truth is, they're both the same answer. Ultimately, Hashem's desire is not to destroy the Rishayim. Hashem's desire is in the tshuva of the Rishayim. Hashem's desire is that we change our behavior, we change our actions. So in Sodom and Gomorrah, had there been one tzaddik there, as the Chumash tells us, that tzaddik would have protected, would have brought shmira to the entire cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Because there was no tzaddik, they were destroyed. So here again, by the Cheta Ego, Hashem wants to punish Klal Yisrael, but at the same time, he sends Moshe Rabbeinu down that his presence should be a protection for Klal Yisrael. And this is, in fact, exactly what Moshe Rabbeinu does. Moshe Rabbeinu answers, as Avraham Avinu did. This is exactly where Avraham Avinu answered the call, because Hashem tells Avraham Avinu, I'm going to destroy them. But what does Hashem want from Avraham Avinu? He wants exactly what Avraham Avinu did. And it's such a lesson for all of us. He wanted Avraham Avinu to stand up and protect them, to daven for them, to be there for them, even if that protection wasn't going to work, which in that case it wasn't. But the lesson was still there. That our job, the job of Avraham Avinu and all of his descendants, is to be there for humanity, to daven to Hashem, certainly to be there for each other. And we see this again by Moshe Rabbeinu. On one hand, Hashem says to Moshe Rabbeinu, this nation is a stiff-necked nation. Here they are under the chuppah, right after Matan Torah, and they're mizana under the chuppah. They engage in znus right under the chuppah. What kind of nation is this? But on the other hand, he sends Moshe Rabbeinu down to act as a sort of shmira. And this is exactly what Moshe Rabbeinu does. And what does Moshe Rabbeinu say to Hashem? Macheni na misifracha. If you are going to destroy them, erase me from your book. Now we have to understand exactly the symbolism of this statement of Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu's into every fiber of his being, every cell of his body was permeated with love of Torah. Torah's Moshe, to this day we call it by his name. His entire existence was transmitting Torah from Hashem to Klal Yisrael. Macheni no mesifracha is literally the ultimate statement of Mesiras Nefesh, of self-sacrifice. Erase me from Torah. Take my entire existence away from me if you will take away Klal Yisrael, if you will destroy Klal Yisrael. Moshe Rabbeinu gave us the ultimate protection. And we see this is exactly what Hashem wanted. This is what Hashem wanted. And this is exactly why he sent Moshe Rabbeinu back then. I was thinking today, as I was learning this piece from Yisrael Salanter, I was thinking about us today. Who's the tzaddik today? And I'm not saying that perhaps there are tzaddikim in certain corners of the world, but the worldwide tzaddik, somebody like the Chavetz Chaim, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Vilna, that the entire Jewish world looked at as a spiritual leader, as a spiritual giant, as somebody to go to for guidance, protection, shmira, tefillah. Who is that today? I don't know that it exists today. So what does that mean for our generation? We're almost like a Dor Yosef, our generation. We're like an orphaned generation. Every generation before us had a spiritual giant, a great tzaddik who we could look to. And our generation, and again, we do have tzaddikim in the world today, but they're individual tzaddikim. I don't know if we have a tzaddik today that is recognized by worldwide Jewry as our spiritual guide and leader. We're literally like a Dor Yosef. We're like an orphan generation. And then I remember the Zohar. And the Zohar says that every single one of us is an ispashtus de Moshe. Every one of us, every Jew has a nitzut, has a spark of Moshe Rabbeinu's neshama within them. And I think in our generation, the calling of our generation is to be that Moshe Rabbeinu. It's to be that person that stands up and is willing to sacrifice themselves for our fellow Jews in every way, to give of ourselves financially, to give of our time, to give of our efforts, to learn with another Jew, to inspire another Jew, to be there for another Jew. Today, we're the Moshe Rabbeinus, every one of us. That's our that's who we are. And I want to share with you a beautiful thought from the Piazetzner Rebbe, the Eish Kodesh. And he said this in 1940 in Tav Shin in Parshas Sisa. And he brings the level of self-sacrifice of Moshe Rabbeinu. When Moshe Rabbeinu says, Macheni na misifra, says the Piazetzner Rebbe, there's a pasuk right before that doesn't get enough attention. I'm going to pull back up the screen for a second. Let's look. I just want to share with you the verse right before Moshe Rabbeinu says that, because he says something else that's incredibly powerful. Let's move down over here. It's Lamed Aleph, Lamed Pasuk Lamed Aleph, Lamed Beis. Yeah. So look at Pasuk Lamed Aleph. Moshe Rabbeinu says, this is right before, go to Lamed Beis, Pasuk Lamed Beis. It says, Va'ata im tisa chatasam, and now Hashem, if you'll forgive them, if you'll forgive Klal Yisrael, right? That's what I want. That's good. Ve'im ayin, but if you will not forgive them, macheni na mesifrecha, erase me from your book, Asher Ksavta, which you have written. Erase me from the Torah. Just parenthetically, I've mentioned this before. It's a parenthetical, but macheni is a combination of Mei Noach, the waters of Noach. Moshe Rabbeinu was a reincarnation of Noach. What was Noach's fatal flaw? We spoke about this in Parshas Noach. Noach's fatal flaw was he did not die. He didn't sacrifice himself. He didn't daven to Hashem. He didn't plead on behalf of his nation. The flood happened. He protected himself, but he didn't daven. He didn't beseech Hashem. He wasn't like Avraham Avinu. And we spoke about this. Kedusha Levi has a beautiful idea about this. But this was Moshe Rabbeinu was a Gilgul of Noach. And here's Moshe Rabbeinu rectifying, because every reincarnation is a rectification of the previous one. Here's Moshe Rabbeinu rectifying, and here the Torah alludes to it, Macheni Mei Noach. Because after all, why does, the Navi, Mei Noach comes from the Navi. The Navi calls it Mei Noach, the waters of, why are they called Mei Noach? The floodwaters weren't Noach's fault. He was the one tzaddik, but because he didn't daven to stop it, he holds some level of responsibility. So Moshe Rabbeinu rectifies that sin right here. He stands up and defends, and is a defender of Klal Yisrael. But says the Piazetz Rebbe, look at the pasuk right before this. Fascinating. Look what Moshe Rabbeinu says. Look at pasuk Lamed Aleph. Vayashav Moshe al Hashem vayomar. Moshe Rabbeinu returns to Hashem and he says as follows. Now here's Moshe Rabbeinu. Now imagine this is a court case now, right? Moshe Rabbeinu is the attorney for the defendant for Klal Yisrael, and he goes and he approaches Hashem and he defends Klal Yisrael. And his biggest defense is what he says in the next pasuk: "Machini na mesifrecha, erase me from your book." But look how he introduces the defense. So vayashav Moshe al Hashem, Moshe returns to Hashem, and he begins to argue in defense of Klal Yisrael. And what's his first argument? Vayomer, he says, "Ana chata ha'am hazeh chata gedel." This nation has sinned tremendously. They made themselves a god of gold. Tremendous sin. Now, what kind of attorney is that? What kind of defense is that? That's Moshe Rabbeinu is supposed to be defending us. So how is it that instead of defending us, Moshe Rabbeinu says the exact opposite? He magnifies the sin. There's ways to minimize this. Like the Ramban explains that they weren't trying to replace Hashem. It's clear from their verbiage, right? They said, "Where's Moshe? He's not here. We need somebody to lead." They're looking to replace Moshe Rabbeinu. They weren't looking to replace Hashem. But again, when we delve into the story of the Chet HaEgel, there were layers of sin there. There were some who engaged in all kinds of sins around the Chet HaEgel as well, Gili Arayas, etc., Shvichas Damim. There were some who engaged in real sin and real idolatry, and then there were others who were looking to replace Moshe Rabbeinu, and then there were others who just stood by and watched and didn't say anything. There were gradations of sin. But Moshe Rabbeinu seems to be talking about the lowliest ones. What he's telling Hashem is, and then he says, in the very next pasuk, this nation has sinned tremendously. And if you forgive them, good. And if not, macheni na mesifrecha. What Moshe Rabbeinu says the Piazetz Rebbe, something so powerful. He's telling Hashem, I am willing to sacrifice my entire existence. I am willing to sacrifice my entire mitzias, every fiber of my being, every cell of my existence is Torah. I'm willing to sacrifice it, not just for the righteous Jews, not just for the tzaddikim, not just for the Jews who stood by and watched, even for the Jews who were even for the lowliest Jews who were engaged in the lowliest behaviors, who are mezaneh under the chuppah. Even those Jews, I am willing to completely give up my entire existence for. That's what Hashem wants. That's a Jewish leader. That's what it means to be a Moshe. to be able to sacrifice, to be able to give of ourselves, to be able to extend ourselves on behalf of not just the righteous, not just the so-so, but even the lowliest. This was the Avos Yisrael, the self-sacrifice of a leader. And today, we are that Moshe Rabbeinu. Parshas Sisa calls upon every single one of us today to be that Moshe Rabbeinu, to extend ourselves, to put ourselves out there for every single Jew, those who are lofty and those who are lowly, those who are knowledgeable and those who aren't knowledgeable. And it's fascinating that this Parsha, the Parsha that teaches us this lesson, is the Parsha that's sandwiched between Truma Tetzava and Vayaka Pakude. What is Truma Tetzava? Truma Tetzava is Hashem's commandment for the Mishkan. And Vayaka Pakude is us building the Mishkan, is us actually doing it. The connection between the two, if we want to make a dwelling place for Hashem, that's the Mishkan. If we want to make a home for Hashem here in this world, the way to make a home for Hashem is to ensure that we are there for all of Hashem's children, making the world a better place for all of Hashem's children, protecting all of Hashem's children, standing in defense of all of Hashem's children. That's how we make a dwelling place for Hashem. What's interesting is, I mean, it's a beautiful lesson, a powerful Piazetzner Rebbe that he brings this out, that and again, Piazetzner Rebbe in the Warsaw Ghetto, and probably talking to religious Jews, assimilated Jews, non-religious Jews, everything was in the Warsaw Ghetto. And what Rabbi Yisrael Salanter is saying is a Jew is a Jew is a Jew. And we have to stand up and defend every single one. Moshe Rabbeinu didn't say, Macheni na Masifrika for the tzaddikim. He said it for the Jews who fall into the category of Ana, Achata, Amazeh, Achata Kadela. The Jews who sinned tremendously. Moshe Rabbeinu stood there for. So this is the lesson of Parshas Sisa, the Mesiras Nefesh, the self-sacrifice that we have to have. That's how we build a Mishkan. And the point is that always comes back to us. That is ultimately what Hashem wants. The davening of Avram Avinu for Sodom and Amorah. The Moshe Rabbeinu standing up for the lowliest Jews. This self-sacrifice this is who we are and who we're meant to be. What's interesting is that the Gemara asks, Mordechai min HaTorah minayin. Where is there a remez to Mordechai min HaTorah? And I actually spoke about this. I gave a whole shiur just on this in this house many, many years ago. But Mordechai min HaTorah minayin, and it says a pasuk in our parsha. The pasuk in our parsha is Mordechai is alluded to, where it speaks about the ingredients of the Ketores, and then one of the ingredients is more dror. It's musk, more dror. And the Aramaic translation, Unkelis, is Me'ira Dachya, which put together is Mordechai. So fascinating that Mordechai is alluded to in our Parsha, Parshas Sisa. Why would Mordechai be alluded to here? Haman min HaTorah minayin is alluded to in Parshas Bereshis. I gave a whole shiur on that one and why it's there. Why is Mordechai alluded to here in Parshas Sisa of all the Parshas of the Torah? Why Dafka here? Because this Parsha, the willingness to sacrifice for every single Jew, for a single Jew, was the Metzias of Mordechai. It says that Mordechai, Moshe Rabbeinu was a Gilgul of Noach. Mordechai was a Gilgul of Moshe Rabbeinu. There's a Medrash Talpios, it says that Mordechai was a Gilgul of. Now, why did Moshe Rabbeinu have to be Megagul? It doesn't seem like to rectify anything. It's more maybe the power of that neshama, the power of the Jewish leader to protect Klal Yisrael. So Mordechai was a Gilgul of Moshe Rabbeinu, and Mordechai exemplified this as well. And this is perhaps why Parshas Sisa always falls out in the month of Mordechai. It always falls out in the month of Adar. I want to share with you a beautiful, beautiful Sfas Emes on the Megillah, and that connects to this Aveda of Moshe Rabbeinu, of being willing to sacrifice, of being willing to give of yourself for a single Jew. You know, when we read the story of Megillas Esther, and the story starts off, and throughout the Megillah, there's all kinds of details. The party for 187 days, the murder of the queen being murdered, Haman building the gallows that he's going to hang Mordechai on, and we see how every one of these details is unahapaku, how all of these details ultimately unfold to actually create the miracle. that the party was ultimately resulted in the murder of the queen, which resulted in the vacancy, which resulted in Esther becoming the queen, which resulted in the salvation of the Jewish people. In other words, we see through the benefit of hindsight, we can see how all of the early details in the story, the gallows that Haman built, ultimately he himself and his children were hung on. We see how all the details are ultimately transformed, and that by the end of the story, we have an understanding of why all those details are told, because it's all part of the Nahavah. However, says the Sfas Emes, and he points out such a beautiful point, that there's one detail in the story that never sort of unfolds to anything. And in fact, it's not clear why that detail is even there. And I want to share it with you. I'm going to share my screen again. I want to share with you. This is in Perek Beis, the second chapter of the Megillah. Okay, Megillah Esther. The second chapter of the Megillah, Perek Beis, Pasuk Yud Aleph. So this is after the queen was murdered, right? And they did this beauty contest to make a new queen. And Esther is taken to the king's palace, right? To see, she's one of the people who are taken to be a potential queen. And the pasuk tells us in pasuk Yud Aleph, take a look in pasuk Yud Aleph. Ubechol yom v'yom Mordechai mishalech lifnei chatzer beis hanashim. Oops, 1 second. I don't think I didn't share the screen there. 1 second. Let me share my screen. Hold on. There we go. Pasuk Yud Aleph. Ubechol yom v'yom Mordechai mishalech lifnei chatzer beis hanashim. That every single day, Mordechai would walk by the courtyard of the palace where all these potential queens were kept. And he did this to learn of Esther, to learn how she's doing. Now, why did Mordechai do that? Why did Mordechai walk every day? He wasn't able to communicate with Esther. He wasn't able to embrace her. He wasn't able to tell her, I'm davening for you. I'm looking out for you. He wasn't able to communicate with her. She's in the palace. She's trapped in the palace. Mordechai doesn't even get into the palace. He's walking in front of the courtyard, in front of the gated courtyard of the palace every single day just to check in on her. Why? Because Mordechai knows Esther is all alone. She's an orphan. She lost her mother. She lost her father. Mordechai raised her. She's an orphan alone in the world. She was taken by the king against her will. She doesn't want to be there. We can only imagine the existential loneliness that Esther felt, completely alone. No family, no friends, no chaverim, nobody. And so more says the Sfas Emes that Mordechai would go by the palace every single day just in the hopes that Esther would get a glimpse of him from a window in the palace and see that she wasn't alone. It was a message that Mordechai was giving Esther: you aren't alone. I am here for you. And even if I can't see you, and even if I can't talk to you, I'm going to walk by this palace every single day. And by the way, this is Mordechai HaTzadik. He's an incredibly busy Jew. He's the head of the Sanhedrin. He's the Nasi Ador. He's the head rabbi of the Jewish people. He could have sent a messenger. He could have sent somebody else, but he himself every single day. And sometimes we don't get sort of like the timeline when we're reading like one parak to another, one pasuk to another. What's the time frame? Esther was taken in the 7th year of Achashverosh's reign, and the story of the Megillah happened in the 12th year. For 5 years, Mordechai walked by that palace. Mordechai, probably the busiest Jew, the Nasi Hador, the head of the Sanhedrin, for 5 years, walked by that palace every single day. The Megillah tells us this detail, but then the story unfolds. That detail seems to be irrelevant. Why is that detail even there? It doesn't unfold to anything. I mean, we all know how the story ends, but that particular detail of Mordechai going back and forth doesn't seem to result in any of the miracles. Why is that there? Says the Sfas Emes. Lest you think that's an irrelevant detail in the entire story. Says the Sfas Emes, it's important for us to realize what gave Mordechai the schus to be the vehicle of salvation, to be the vehicle of Yeshua, to be the vehicle of Hatzalah to Klal Yisrael. You know what gave Mordechai that schus? B'chol yom v'yom. Every single day, he dedicated himself. He sacrificed himself time and time again, no matter how busy he was, no matter what his schedule was. And it says, Shabbos, Sunday, Thursday, Wednesday, Tuesday, every single day for 5 years, seemingly resulting in nothing. He couldn't talk to her, he couldn't communicate with her, couldn't embrace her, couldn't send a message to her, seemingly accomplishing nothing. But it was that act of self-sacrifice, that symbolic act of self-sacrifice. And in fact, the Medrash in Megillah and in Esther Rabbah says exactly this, that the entire miracle happened because of that story, because of that detail. That's why it's in the Megillah. That's why it's in Perek Beis. Yes, it's not like the murder of the queen or the party or the gallows that ultimately we see how it unfolded. Here's a detail. It doesn't seem to unfold into anything. This detail embedded and hidden in the Megillah. And we never even talk about it, never even notice it. Because it seems to be almost an unforgettable, a forgettable act. He's walking every day in front of the Chatzar. Who cares? But Hashem cares. The fact that he was willing to give of himself, the Nasi Hador, the head of the Sanhedrin, was willing to give of himself for a single Jew. That brought salvation to the world. And that's perhaps why Mordechai is alluded to where? In the Parsha of Sisa, where the message in the Parsha of Sisa is Moshe Rabbeinu's sacrifice on behalf of every single Jew. And this is the powerful, this is ultimately the lesson of the Megillah and the lesson of Parshas Sisa dovetail together. Says this Sfas Emes, this is the entire, there's many lessons of the Megillah, but this is the crux, this is almost the apex of all the lessons. When you give of yourself for another Jew, give of your time, give of your effort, give of your resources for another Jew, when you stand on behalf of another Jew, and it doesn't even have to be a righteous Jew, to the contrary. Moshe Rabbeinu stood up for the lowliest Jew. That's the lesson, says the Pizetz Rebbe. And that's the lesson of Purim. That's the lesson of the story of Purim. When we give of ourselves, we bring salvation to the world. And sometimes it's counterintuitive because we think, well, why should I give of myself? I have to take for myself. If I don't take for myself, who's going to take for me? And that's sort of our nature. And so Parshas Sisa teaches us transcend your nature, because when you give of yourself, when you sacrifice to yourself, you don't only bring salvation to yourself ultimately, you bring salvation to the world. You bring salvation to Klal Yisrael. I was telling my wife, I just read this story. It happened a few years ago of this neonatologist who, this was 30 years ago. This neonatologist, his name was Dr. Michael Shannon, and he had a 3.5-pound baby who a lot of the doctors had given up on 30 years ago. Today, babies live at 1 pound. But 30 years ago, 3.5-pound baby was masukan. The baby life was in danger, and a lot of the doctors had given up. But this Dr. Michael Shannon, Yemim V'Laylo, dedicated himself to saving this baby's life, and he did. He ended up saving this baby's life. And fast forward 30 years later, there's an accident on a I think it was in California, an accident on a highway in California, and this baby, whose name was Chris Trokey, he was a fireman, and he rushed to the scene, and sure enough, the SUV had been hit by one of these big trucks, and it was overturned and on fire, and there was something trapped in there, and through the jaws of life, this Chris Trokey saved the driver. And the Chris Trokey was this baby, and the driver happened to be the doctor that saved Dr. Michael. He didn't even realize at the time until they got him to the hospital, and then in the hospital they saved this Dr. Shannon. His life was saved, obviously, by this Chris Trokey. And only in the hospital did they tell the fireman, this Chris Trokey, that the patient was Dr. Michael Shannon. He realized that was the doctor that saved him when he was a baby. And so, and the doctor, they told the story to the doctor as well. And here you see, you give of yourself to save a single life, it always comes back to you. That's the lesson of that story. That story we see the lesson b'muchash, but this is the lesson of Parshas Sisa. This is ultimately the lesson of Purim, that if we want to bring salvation to the world, and there hasn't been a time when Klal Yisrael, at least in our lifetimes, that we need salvation more than we need it now. We need Mashiach more than we've ever needed it. We need it now. We need Mashiach. And so here's this. It's perfect timing. Parshas Sisa gives us the recipe. If you want to bring salvation to the world, if you want to bring a tzahal of a samecha to Klal Yisrael, be a Mordechai. make sure to walk past the chutzner of the palace of the king to protect one single Jew. The entire story of the Megillah didn't begin with one Jew saving the world. It began with one Jew walking by the courtyard of the palace to show a single orphan that she's not alone. That was what brought salvation to the world. So Amir Hashem, if we can internalize a little bit of the message of Sisa and give of ourselves for others, give of ourselves for Klal Yisrael, give of ourselves for a single Jew, the world might not applaud you. Nobody may see it. I was speaking in my shul on Shabbos, and I said, I know of a family, and multiple families who are struggling, various struggles with children off the derech, and children who have gone off the path, and these parents are there for that child. They're there spiritually, emotionally, physically. The child doesn't reciprocate. The child doesn't appreciate it as of yet. Of course, they will eventually. Nobody applauds them, but you know what? Hashem sees it. And that is heroic. And it's that heroism of being there, even when it's unappreciated, and even when it's not reciprocated, Kadosh Baruch Hu sees it. And it's that being there for another Jew, whether it's your child or whether it's a stranger. It's being there like that that brings salvation to the world. It's the story of Avram Avinu. It's the story of Moshe Rabbeinu. It's why, and I'll just conclude with this. If you take a look at the very last pasuk of the entire Torah, look at the very last pasuk of the entire Torah. The very last pasuk of the entire Torah speaks about the wonders, the miracles that Moshe Rabbeinu did, le'enei kol Yisrael. And that's how the Torah ends. And what does Rashi say? What's the miracle? What's the godless, le'enei kol Yisrael? The breaking of the luches. The breaking of the luches was Moshe Rabbeinu sacrificing Torah. Because if there's one thing, as much as every fiber of Moshe Rabbeinu's being was Torah, as much as every cell of his body was reverberated with Torah, there was one thing that was more precious to Moshe Rabbeinu, and that was Klal Yisrael. And he shattered the luches to protect Klal Yisrael, as we've learned about other times, right? Because they shouldn't be obligated. So he shattered the luches, he shattered Torah to protect Klal Yisrael. Similarly, how the Lubavitcher Rebbe explains Moshe Rabbeinu hitting the rock, right? Moshe Rabbeinu hitting the rock was one of the tragedies of Moshe Rabbeinu's life, right? For that, he doesn't go into Eretz Yisrael. And yet, the Lubavitcher Rebbe taught a song on Simchas Torah, Ala Selahacha. And every year, Lubavitcher sing this, Ala Selahacha, and we dance to this. And the Rebbe asked the question, how could we dance to Ala Selahacha? Ala Selahacha was a tragedy. That Moshe Rabbeinu hit the rock was a tragedy. So he says, not necessarily. He says, yes, it was because Moshe Rabbeinu couldn't go into the land for that. But why did Moshe Rabbeinu hit the rock? There's all kinds of explanations, and everybody gives an answer, but the Rebbe gives such a beautiful answer. He says Moshe Rabbeinu hit the rock to protect the dignity of Klal Yisrael. Klal Yisrael was rebelling. Klal Yisrael was not listening to the Dvar Hashem. And Moshe Rabbeinu knew that if he spoke to the rock would listen to Dvar Hashem. And it would be a humiliation that the rock listens to the rock without das, without sensitivity, without ears, without intellect, listens to Dvar Hashem, and Klal Yisrael doesn't. So Moshe Rabbeinu hit the rock not to give the rock that opportunity to protect the dignity of Klal Yisrael. For that, why Moshe Rabbeinu was a good thing. So why does Hashem punish him? Well, there's all kinds of. The Rebbe continues. There was Moshe Rabbeinu. The idea was Moshe Rabbeinu not to hit the rock so that Jews would be inspired by the rock listening. But the point is, Moshe Rabbeinu's kavana, Moshe Rabbeinu's intention was protection of Klal Yisrael at his own, not to go into Eretz Yisrael. Moshe Rabbeinu knew he was transgressing Dvar Hashem, which again for Moshe Rabbeinu that's his whole mitzias. But if there's one thing that's more precious to him, it's his connection to Klal Yisrael. And that's what we embrace. And that's what we sing Ala Salah. And that's what Macheni Nama Sifrika is. And that's what Mordechai did. And that's perhaps why Moshe Rabbeinu was a reincarnation of Noach, because he rectified that. And Mordechai extended that protection of Moshe Rabbeinu, that self-sacrifice of Moshe Rabbeinu, and we see that in the story of Purim. But we see that when we're there and when we are present for our fellow man, when we're present for our fellow Jew, that brings salvation to the world. It doesn't have to be well publicized. Nobody needs to know. HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows, and that brings Yeshua. So Amir Tzashem, every one of us will internalize the lesson of Parshas Sisa, the lesson that the Tzlas Emes teaches us with Mordechai HaTzadik. Be there for another Jew and bring Yeshua, V'atzala, V'smeicha, the Klal Yisrael. Take of Miyad Mamish with the coming Mashiach Tzidkenu, B'imheir V'yameinu, Amen. So let's do Kapitel Tilim together. Yeah. Yeah. Hashgacha pratis. Okay, we're gonna do Tehillim. What do we do? 121, right? Okay, so we're gonna do Tehillim in the schus of our Achenu v'Achisenu b'Eretz Yisrael, particularly our soldiers, our heroes, our Giburi Chayo. Hashem should protect them wherever they may be and bring them Yeshua, the Tzahala, the Smecha, with the ultimate victory of Klal Yisrael in Eretz Yisrael, with the ultimate victory, the coming Mashiach Tzidkenu, Amen. So, Tilim 121. Shir Lamala, Iseseinai Hari Miyayin Yavo Ezri Mi Madinai Eise Shemayim Biaret. Ayitin Lamay Raglecha, Ayanim Shemrecha. Hine Layanim Layishan Shema Yisrael. Adinoi Shem Recha Nitzil Chayad Yaminecha. Yea, Mama Shemesh Leikecha V'Yerecha Laila. Adinoi Yishmarcha Mikara Yishmaretz Nafshecha. Adinoi Yishmer Tzeiska V'Yecha Mi'ata V'Yad Eilam. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining. Amir Hashem, we're not going to have Shiur next week, but Amir Hashem will be back in 2 weeks. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a wonderful week.